In the 1920s, a widow named May Rindge hired armed guards to patrol her own coastline. She spent 17 years and roughly $20 million in court, fighting to keep a single public road from ever being built through her land. She lost. That road became the Pacific Coast Highway, and the moment it opened in 1929, it did exactly what Rindge feared. It let the world in. Movie stars started leasing beachfront cottages by the dozen. Within a few decades, this narrow strip of coastline had become the most famous, most photographed, most envied 21 miles of real estate in America. Then, in January 2025, that same road turned into something else entirely. The only way out. A wildfire tore through Malibu so fast that thousands of residents, some of the wealthiest people on Earth, found themselves fleeing bumper to bumper on the exact highway May Rindge once tried to keep out of existence altogether. Homes worth tens of millions of dollars burned to their foundations. A restaurant that had fed locals since the 1970s was gone within hours. But this isn't only a story about one catastrophic week. It's the story of how a family's private coastline became the most exposed 21 miles in America. This is Malibu, California. And it all started with a Spanish land grant and a widow who refused to sell. Chapter 1: A Kingdom by the Water. Long before anyone called it Malibu, the Chumash people called this stretch of coast Humaliwo. The surf sounds loudly. They had lived here for thousands of years, fishing these waters and building a genuine, thriving culture along this exact shoreline. This was long before Spain, Mexico, or the United States ever laid claim to a single acre of it. In 1804, the Spanish governor of California granted this land to a soldier named José Bartolomé Tapia. It rewarded his military service with roughly 13,000 acres stretching along the coast and up into the Santa Monica Mountains. Tapia had seen this land as a young man, riding through it during an earlier military expedition. He specifically requested it when the time came to ask for his own grant. He settled here, ran cattle, and raised a family on ground the Chumash had occupied for generations before him. It was a transition that reshaped the entire region from a network of native villages into a working cattle operation. Ownership passed through several hands over the following decades. Tapia's family lost their claim when they couldn't produce the paperwork American authorities demanded after California joined the United States. It was a bureaucratic failure that cost them a rancho their family had lived on for 2 generations. An Irish immigrant named Matthew Keller eventually secured formal legal title in 1872. He successfully navigated the documentation requirements the Tapia family never could. 2 decades later, in 1892, Keller's son sold the entire ranch, by then known as Rancho Topanga Malibu Sequit, to a wealthy Boston transplant named Frederick Hastings Rindge. The price was around $10 an acre, a figure that reflected just how remote and undeveloped this stretch of coastline still was. Rindge had genuine ambition for this land. A Harvard-educated heir to a substantial family fortune, he dreamed openly of transforming Malibu into something like the French Riviera. He wanted a private paradise of orange groves and ocean views entirely under his own family's control. He built a Victorian ranch house. He expanded his holdings to roughly 17,000 acres by buying out neighboring homesteaders one property at a time. He spent his days walking the property, writing verse, and imagining exactly the kind of world he intended to build here, largely free from outside interference. That vision took its first real hit in 1903, years before Hollywood had any interest in this coastline at all. A fire tore through Rindge's ranch and destroyed the family's original house. It was a genuine, costly setback for a family that had only recently begun to establish itself on this land. It was nothing close to what was still coming. Nobody in 1903 could have guessed that fire, in one form or another, would keep returning to this exact stretch of coastline for the next 120 years. It kept coming again and again, in a pattern almost nobody who eventually moved here would ever fully escape. Rindge rebuilt after that first fire, refusing to let a single disaster derail the larger vision he'd staked his fortune on. It was a pattern his own family would repeat and repeat again for generations after he was gone, long after his name had faded from the property he'd once dreamed of turning into an American Riviera. The Rindge family's story, in many ways, set the template for everything Malibu would eventually become. Extraordinary private wealth, poured into a stretch of land whose natural beauty and inherent danger would always exist in the exact same breath. Neither one was ever fully separable from the other, no matter how much money anyone tried to spend keeping them apart. Chapter 2. The Queen of Malibu. Frederick Rindge died in 1905, leaving his wife, Rhoda May Rindge, in full control of the family's vast coastal holdings. May Rindge inherited her husband's dream and turned it into something closer to an obsession. She became known across California as the Queen of Malibu, a landowner fiercely determined to keep her family's ranch exactly as private as Frederick had always imagined it. When the state of California began pushing to build a coastal road through her property in the 1910s, connecting Santa Monica to points further north, Rindge refused to allow it. She treated the proposal as a direct assault on everything her late husband had spent his final years building. She didn't simply refuse quietly. She hired armed guards to patrol her land and turn away surveyors attempting to plot a route through her property. She built her own private railroad specifically to avoid needing to grant right-of-way to the Southern Pacific, which had also been eyeing a route through her property for its own commercial purposes. She fought the state in court, case after case, for 17 straight years. She spent an estimated $20 million in legal fees, an almost incomprehensible sum for the era, one that steadily drained a fortune that had once seemed genuinely limitless. It's worth understanding what she was actually protecting. This wasn't simply stubbornness for its own sake. Rindge genuinely believed that opening her land to the public would destroy the very qualities that made it valuable in the first place. Its isolation, its wildness, its distance from the crowded, rapidly growing city of Los Angeles just a few miles to the east. She saw herself, by most accounts, as a genuine steward protecting something rare and irreplaceable, not merely as a wealthy landowner defending her own private interests. She wasn't wrong about what would eventually happen once the public gained access. She simply couldn't stop it from happening anyway. In the end, the court sided decisively with the state. The legal fight established an important precedent about the public's right to access scenic coastline, a principle that still shapes California land use decisions today, decades after the original case was decided. May Rindge had fought one of the longest, most expensive private land battles in American history. She had lost every meaningful round of it. Watching her family's total control over this stretch of coastline slip away one court ruling at a time. She died in 1941, having spent nearly her entire adult life either building or defending a vision of Malibu that the outside world would eventually reshape entirely on its own terms. Whatever else might be said about her methods, her devotion to this specific piece of land was never in question. It was a devotion the courts ultimately decided couldn't override the public's own claim to the same coastline. By the time of her death, the road she'd fought so hard to prevent had already been open for over a decade, carrying visitors past the very land she'd once patrolled with armed guards. Chapter 3. The Road That Let the World In. In 1929, the Roosevelt Highway, soon renamed the Pacific Coast Highway, officially opened for public traffic through Malibu. May Rindge's 17-year resistance was finally, formally over. But something remarkable had already started happening even before the road fully opened. Rindge, drowning in legal fees and desperate for income, had begun leasing small beachfront lots along her property starting in 1926. It was a stopgap financial measure meant to help cover her mounting court case. She could never have predicted what that decision would actually unleash, or how completely it would eventually eclipse everything else she'd spent her life fighting to protect. Silent film stars discovered those lots almost immediately. Bing Crosby leased one. So did Gloria Swanson, Gary Cooper, and eventually Clark Gable and Lana Turner. Each star paid around $30 a month for a 30-foot wide strip of beachfront. It was close enough to Hollywood for an easy drive, remote enough to still feel like a genuine escape from the pressures of fame and public attention. This stretch of coastline became known almost overnight as the Malibu Movie Colony, a name that would define this narrow strip of sand for the rest of the century. The growth was staggering. By 1928, just 2 years after Rindge first began leasing those lots, the colony was already, in the words of one local historian, wall-to-wall houses. It was a genuinely remarkable transformation for land that had been almost entirely undeveloped just a few years earlier. Fan magazines and newspapers covered the colony obsessively. They fed a public fascination with exactly where their favorite stars spent their weekends, running photo spreads and gossip columns that turned this private beach into a topic of national conversation. The same isolation May Rindge had fought so hard to preserve became, almost instantly, the single most valuable thing about this coastline. It was a place famous people could be simultaneously visible and private, photographed and protected all at once, a paradox that would define Malibu's appeal for generations to come. There's a real irony worth sitting with here. Everything May Rindge fought to prevent, public access, outside development, the loss of her family's total control, is exactly what created Malibu's actual fame and value. Her defeat wasn't simply a loss. It was the entire origin story of everything Malibu eventually became. Within a few short years, this narrow strip of coastline had transformed from one family's private ranch into the most famous, most photographed, most envied real estate in America. It happened almost entirely because the very battle Rindge lost made this place a story the whole country wanted to follow. A public fascination that has, in one form or another, never really faded. Later decades brought an even wider range of residents chasing that same combination of privacy and prestige. Directors, musicians, and business executives followed the original wave of movie stars. Each new generation was drawn by the same basic promise: proximity to the entertainment industry, genuine physical beauty, and just enough separation from Los Angeles proper to feel like an actual retreat rather than simply another neighborhood. By the 1960s and 70s, Malibu's reputation had expanded well beyond its original movie colony roots. Musicians drawn to the region's laid-back atmosphere added a whole new dimension to the area's cultural identity, one that existed alongside, rather than replacing, the older Hollywood glamour the colony had first established decades earlier. Surfers, artists, and a genuine bohemian element settled alongside the wealth. This gave Malibu a more complicated, layered identity than the simple postcard image of movie star mansions alone could ever fully capture. Chapter 4. Burning since the beginning. Malibu's relationship with fire didn't begin in 2025, or even in recent decades. It's been a defining, recurring feature of this landscape since before Hollywood ever arrived. Rindge's own Malibu Potteries, a ceramic tile operation May had built to help generate income during her legal battles, burned down in a devastating 1931 fire. This was compounded further by the financial pressure of the Great Depression hitting at almost the exact same time. The operation, which had produced tiles still visible today on buildings like the Adamson House in Los Angeles City Hall, never reopened. 9,000 boxes of tile were salvaged from the wreckage. A small, tangible remnant of a business fire had simply erased. It took with it one of the few income sources Rindge had left after decades of legal fees. The movie colony itself faced serious fires almost immediately after it was built. Devastating blazes hit the area in 1929 and 1930, barely years after the first celebrities had moved in. It was an unwelcome reminder that fame and fortune offered no real protection against the landscape itself. Then, between 1935 and 1938, an even more serious stretch of fires burned through the region, destroying nearly 400 homes across Malibu and the surrounding hills. For a community barely a decade old, built specifically around the promise of exclusive, protected beauty, this was a brutal early lesson in exactly what this landscape was actually capable of, regardless of who happened to be living on it. The underlying cause has never really changed. Malibu sits in a landscape defined by dry chaparral brush, steep canyons, and the same Santa Ana winds that periodically sweep in from the desert. Those winds arrive hot and fast and bone dry, turning any spark into a serious threat within minutes. These aren't unusual conditions for this stretch of coastline. They're the baseline, the normal state of affairs that happens to become genuinely dangerous every several years when drought, wind, and ignition all line up at once. It's a combination this landscape has produced with grim regularity for as long as anyone has kept records. By most informal counts, Some version of significant fire has struck Malibu roughly every 5 to 7 years since the 1930s. That's not a modern crisis suddenly emerging out of nowhere. It's closer to the actual consistent rhythm of this particular landscape. Residents, insurers, and firefighters have had to plan around it for the better part of a century, whether they fully realized it or not when they first decided to build a life here. Fire departments serving Malibu developed genuinely specialized expertise over these decades. They learned the particular way fire moves through this landscape's steep canyons and narrow ridgelines. Knowledge passed down through generations of local firefighters who understood this terrain in a way outside crews, however skilled, simply couldn't match on short notice. That local expertise would prove essential again and again, even as the fires themselves kept growing larger and more destructive with each passing decade. Climate scientists studying Southern California's fire patterns in recent years have pointed to longer, more intense dry seasons as a genuine, measurable factor compounding this already dangerous baseline. The same underlying conditions that have always threatened Malibu appear to be arriving with somewhat greater frequency and severity than they did even a generation earlier, a trend fire officials now factor directly into their own long-term planning. Chapter 5. What everyone actually came for. Ask anyone who's spent real time in Malibu what they remember, and the answers tend to be surprisingly specific, rooted in exact places rather than vague impressions. Malibu Pier became one of the area's genuine landmarks, a wooden structure extending out over the water where visitors fished, strolled, and watched surfers below. It's a piece of infrastructure that's survived in various rebuilt forms since the early 20th century. Speaking of surfing, Malibu holds a real, foundational place in the sport's American history. The particular quality of the waves breaking near Surfrider Beach helped shape modern surfing style in the mid-20th century. It drew dedicated surfers from across the world specifically to ride these exact waves, a reputation the area has never fully lost, even as the surrounding real estate grew more expensive with every passing decade. The Adamson House, built for Rindge's daughter Rhoda and her husband in 1929, still stands today as a genuine architectural showpiece. Its walls and floors are covered in the same colorful Malibu tile the family's pottery company once produced before the fire that ended its operation. A few miles down the coast, the Getty Villa offers visitors a recreated Roman country home housing genuine Greek and Roman antiquities. It's an almost surreal architectural statement sitting directly above the Pacific, funded by one of the wealthiest oil fortunes in American history. Pepperdine University's cliffside campus, built into the hills above the coastline starting in the late 1960s, gave the area a genuine academic institution alongside all the beachfront glamour. Its dormitories and lecture halls look directly out over the same water that drew silent film stars decades earlier. But it was often the smaller, more human-scale places that residents actually built their daily lives around. The Real Inn, a casual seafood restaurant that had fed locals and visitors alike since the 1970s, became exactly this kind of institution. It was unpretentious and beloved in a town otherwise known for extraordinary wealth. The kind of place where a celebrity and a construction worker might genuinely order off the exact same menu. The Malibu Feed Bin, a pet supplies and gifts shop that had operated since 1966, served a similar role. It was a genuine small business that had quietly outlasted decades of change happening all around it, surviving real estate booms, celebrity turnover, and shifting local politics simply by continuing to do the same thing well, year after year. This was the real Malibu many longtime residents actually experienced. Not just celebrity real estate and red carpet glamour, but a specific, tight-knit community built around a handful of genuinely beloved local institutions. These were the kind of places that gave this famous stretch of coastline an actual, lived-in identity beneath all the fame. Locals who'd lived here for decades often measured their own history in this town, not by which celebrities had moved in or out, but by which of these small, familiar businesses were still standing the next time they drove down the Pacific Coast Highway. Local farmers markets and seasonal events added another layer to this same identity, drawing residents together in ways that had nothing to do with fame or real estate values. Longtime residents often describe these gatherings as the real social fabric of the town, a place where neighbors actually knew each other by name, regardless of what any individual family happened to be worth on paper. Local schools played a similar role. They drew together children of A-list celebrities and children of longtime working-class families who'd lived in Malibu for generations, all attending the same classrooms and the same school events. It was a genuine point of community overlap in a town otherwise defined by extraordinary economic disparity, one of the few places where that particular divide genuinely narrowed. Chapter 6. A City of Its Own. Despite being one of the most famous places in America for the better part of a century, Malibu didn't actually become its own independent city until surprisingly late, 1991. For decades before that, Malibu existed as an unincorporated part of Los Angeles County. That meant major decisions about development, zoning, and public services were made by county officials in downtown Los Angeles, not by anyone actually living on this stretch of coastline. That arrangement grew increasingly frustrating for longtime residents. They felt their community's specific needs and character were being ignored by a county government managing a vastly larger and more diverse jurisdiction, one where Malibu's particular concerns often ranked low on a very long list of competing priorities. The push for incorporation gained real momentum over concerns about development pressure and, notably, water quality along the coastline. Residents worried that county-level decisions weren't adequately protecting the ocean and beaches that had always been central to Malibu's identity and appeal. They pointed specifically to concerns about a proposed sewage treatment expansion that many locals felt threatened the very water quality their entire community depended on. After years of local organizing, petition drives, and public meetings, Malibu residents finally voted to incorporate. It gave this famous community its own local government for the first time in its history. It's a genuinely unusual civic timeline. Most places become internationally famous only after they've had decades to establish their own local governance and identity. Malibu did it backwards. It spent 60 years as one of the most recognized names in American culture before it ever had its own city council, its own local decision-making authority over its own streets and shoreline. For most of the 20th century, in other words, the most photographed community in America didn't actually run itself at all. That gap between global fame and local self-governance shaped Malibu's early identity as a city in genuinely unusual ways. New city officials found themselves setting policy for a community whose name already carried enormous international recognition. At the same time, they handled the same basic municipal questions, road maintenance, zoning disputes, trash collection, that any small American town has to work through regardless of how famous its address happens to be. Fire prevention and evacuation planning quickly became one of the young city government's central ongoing responsibilities. It was an area where Malibu's specific geography demanded a level of specialized attention few other California municipalities of similar size ever had to develop, precisely because so few other places carried anything close to the same historical burden of repeated wildfire disaster. Every city council meeting, in one way or another, eventually circled back to the same underlying reality, shaping nearly every decision the young government made. Chapter 7. The Locked Gate. May Rindge's fight to keep this coastline private didn't end when she lost her legal battle in the 1920s. In a real sense, it's still being fought today, just by different people, over a different but closely related question: who actually gets to use Malibu's beaches? California law is unambiguous on this point. All beaches below the mean high tide line are public property, regardless of how expensive or exclusive the homes sitting directly behind them happen to be. In practice, enforcing that right along Malibu's coastline has proven genuinely difficult. Wealthy homeowners have, for decades, found ways to functionally restrict public access anyway. They use misleading private beach signage that has no actual legal standing. They block or hide public access ways that technically exist but are nearly impossible for an ordinary visitor to locate. They position security guards to discourage visitors who have every legal right to be there, but rarely know it. The California Coastal Commission has spent years working to identify and reopen these access points. It's a slow, contentious process that regularly pits ordinary Californians asserting a legal right against some of the wealthiest homeowners in the entire country, many of whom can afford legal teams capable of delaying enforcement for years at a time. Specific, long-running disputes over particular stretches of beach have made regular headlines for decades. This exact fight has become almost its own permanent feature of Malibu's civic life, a recurring news story that resurfaces every few years with a new celebrity name attached to it. There's a real continuity worth naming here, even if the two fights look different on the surface. May Rindge tried to use money, lawyers, and armed guards to keep this coastline entirely private. She genuinely believed that exclusivity and natural beauty were inseparable from one another. A century later, a different generation of wealthy Malibu homeowners has used a different set of tools toward a strikingly similar goal: misleading signage, aggressive security, expensive legal delays. The names and methods have changed. The underlying tension between private wealth and public access never actually went away. It simply moved from the courtroom where Rindge lost her case to the beaches themselves, where the same basic argument continues to play out one access way at a time. Some homeowners have gone even further, constructing elaborate landscaping or fencing specifically designed to make a legally public access way look, from the street, like part of a private residential property. Coastal advocates have responded with their own tools. They publish detailed maps of every legal access point along the Malibu coastline, specifically to counter decades of deliberate confusion sown by property owners who would rather ordinary visitors simply gave up and went somewhere else. Some of the most prominent disputes have involved celebrities themselves, adding an extra layer of public attention to a fight that might otherwise have stayed a relatively obscure local zoning matter. When a well-known resident gets caught blocking a legally public access way, the story tends to travel far beyond Malibu's own city limits. It turns a routine coastal access dispute into national entertainment news almost overnight. A reminder that even a zoning dispute in this particular town rarely stays purely local for very long. Chapter 8: The Modern Fires. Malibu's century-long relationship with fire never really paused. It simply kept recurring, generation after generation, right through to the present day. In November 2018, the Woolsey Fire tore through Malibu and the surrounding hills, forcing widespread evacuations and destroying homes across the community, including a property belonging to singer Miley Cyrus. The fire burned with a speed and intensity that shocked even longtime residents who had lived through previous fire seasons. It was a genuine reminder that the underlying danger here had never actually diminished, no matter how many decades had passed since the fires of the 1930s. Nearly the entire city was placed under mandatory evacuation orders at various points during the blaze, a scale of disruption that touched almost every household in the community, regardless of income or fame. Just over 6 years later, in December 2024, the Franklin Fire broke out and burned dangerously close to Pepperdine University. It forced evacuations and threatened structures across the hillside campus that had stood above the coastline for more than half a century by that point. Firefighters worked to protect the campus directly, a tense, close call that turned out to be, in hindsight, an unsettling preview of something far worse arriving just weeks later. Students and staff sheltered in place on campus during the worst of it, watching flames visible from dormitory windows, an experience that left a lasting impression on an entire generation of Pepperdine students. These weren't isolated, unpredictable disasters. They were simply the latest entries in a pattern this coastline has lived through repeatedly since long before anyone alive today was born. Insurance companies had already begun pulling back from offering coverage in high-risk fire zones across California in the years leading up to these events. It was a genuine, measurable sign that the financial industry itself had started treating Malibu's fire risk as a serious, ongoing structural problem, not simply an occasional bad year. Some homeowners found themselves relying on California's state-backed insurer of last resort, a program originally designed as a stopgap measure that had, by this point, become a genuine necessity for an increasing number of Malibu property owners. Building codes had also tightened considerably in the years following these fires, requiring fire-resistant roofing, defensible space clearance around structures, and other mitigation measures that hadn't existed in earlier decades. These changes reflected a genuine, if incomplete, acknowledgement that the old approach to building in this landscape simply hadn't kept pace with the actual risk residents were facing season after season. Even with those improvements, fire officials continued warning, year after year, that no amount of building code reform could fully offset the underlying combination of dense vegetation, steep terrain, and seasonal winds. Those factors made this specific landscape so consistently vulnerable. The warnings ultimately proved entirely correct. Chapter 9. January 2025. On January 7, 2025, the Palisades Fire broke out in the Santa Monica Mountains. It was fueled by punishing Santa Ana winds and unusually dry conditions following a nearly rainless winter that had left the entire region primed to burn. Within hours, it had grown into one of the most destructive wildfires in Los Angeles County's entire history, moving faster than firefighting crews could contain, even with a massive, immediate response. The fire tore through Pacific Palisades first, then pushed directly into Malibu itself, consuming homes along the coastline with a speed that left almost no time for anything beyond immediate evacuation. Residents, some of them among the wealthiest people on the entire planet, found themselves fleeing on the exact same highway May Rindge had spent 17 years and $20 million trying to keep from ever being built at all. The only road in or out was now packed bumper to bumper with people trying to outrun flames closing in from the hills above. Some abandoned their vehicles entirely when traffic stopped moving, continuing on foot as embers rained down around them. The losses were staggering and deeply personal for the community. Paris Hilton watched her Malibu beach house burn down live on television, describing the moment in real time to a national audience. Billy Crystal lost the home he'd lived in since 1979, a house that had held nearly half a century of his own family's memories. Rosie O'Donnell posted footage of her own destroyed property, simply calling it gone. Actors Adam Brody and Lee Clayton Meester evacuated their Palisades home before it, too, burned to the ground. A property reportedly worth well over $6 million was reduced to ash within hours. But it wasn't only celebrity mansions that vanished that week. The Real Inn, the beloved seafood restaurant that had fed locals since the 1970s, was destroyed. Its familiar wooden dining room and weathered fish menus were gone in a single night. The Malibu feed bin, open since 1966, was gone too. An entire small business was erased in the same disaster that claimed homes worth tens of millions of dollars, treating extraordinary wealth and modest local institutions with exactly the same indifference. By the time the fire was finally fully contained on January 31st, nearly a month after it first broke out, it had burned across Pacific Palisades, Topanga, and Malibu. It left a scale of destruction that even a community with a 100-year history of fire had never quite faced before. News coverage of the fire reached a global audience almost immediately, partly because of the sheer scale of destruction, and partly because of exactly who was affected. Reporters and camera crews from outlets around the world descended on the area within days. This turned the disaster into one of the most extensively documented wildfires in American history. Every burned mansion and every tearful celebrity statement added to a story that felt, to much of the watching public, almost impossible to look away from. That intense public attention brought its own complicated dynamics to the recovery effort. Some residents welcomed the visibility, hoping it might translate into faster government support or greater public sympathy for the community's losses. Others found the constant media presence intrusive during an already devastating period. They resented the way their private tragedy had become, almost overnight, a form of public spectacle. It played out on television screens and social media feeds across the entire country, replayed and dissected by strangers who had never once set foot on the same stretch of coastline, now filling their timelines. Chapter 10. Rebuilding Again. In the aftermath of January 2025, Malibu faced the same fundamental question it has faced after every serious fire since the 1930s. Rebuild? And if so, how? The permitting and rebuilding process has moved slowly, complicated by insurance disputes, environmental review requirements, and the sheer scale of destruction across such a wide stretch of coastline all at once. Even Malibu's wealthiest residents, people who could seemingly absorb almost any financial setback, found themselves navigating an insurance market that had already been pulling back from high-risk fire zones for years before this specific disaster ever happened. It was a genuine structural problem no amount of personal wealth could simply purchase its way around. Some property owners have described spending months simply working through claims paperwork before construction on a replacement home could even realistically begin. And yet, if the previous 100 years are any real guide, Malibu will almost certainly rebuild. It's the same way it rebuilt after the fires of the 1930s, after Woolsey in 2018, after every previous disaster this coastline has absorbed since long before anyone currently living here first arrived. That's the actual, honest pattern underneath everything this story has covered. A place that burns and rebuilds and burns again, roughly every 5 to 7 years. The reasons are rooted entirely in its own specific geography, its dry brush and its narrow canyons and its punishing seasonal winds, conditions that no amount of money or fame has ever managed to fully engineer away. The road May Rindge fought so desperately to keep out is still the only way in or out today, exactly as it's been since 1929. It's still the route residents take fleeing a fire. It's still the route contractors and moving trucks take arriving to help rebuild afterward. The same single highway that turned Malibu's private ranch into the most famous stretch of coastline in America is the same single highway that keeps testing, generation after generation, exactly how much this place can survive and still remain worth returning to. Every rebuild is, in its own way, another vote for the same answer this community has given a dozen times before. Yes, it's worth it, whatever the risk turns out to be next time. That answer isn't universal, though. Some longtime residents, particularly older homeowners who had already lived through Woolsey or earlier fires, made the opposite choice after January 2025. They decided the financial and emotional cost of rebuilding, yet again, simply wasn't worth it anymore. They sold scorched lots to developers or newer buyers willing to take on the risk, leaving a community they'd called home for decades. This became part of the same slow churn of arrivals and departures that has defined this coastline since the very first celebrities leased their $30 a month cottages nearly a century earlier. New buyers, undeterred by the same risk that drove their predecessors away, moved in almost as quickly. They continued a cycle of turnover that has, in its own way, defined this stretch of coastline for just as long as the fires themselves have, generation after generation, arrival after arrival. So that's the story of Malibu. Now I want to hear from you. Have you visited Malibu before or after the January 2025 fires? Have you driven the Pacific Coast Highway yourself, maybe without ever knowing the full story behind why that road exists at all? Maybe you watched the fires unfold from a distance, the way most of the country did, through news coverage and social media. Maybe you know someone who lost a home there, whether it was worth a modest amount or tens of millions of dollars. Tell us your Malibu story in the comments below. And if this story showed you what it actually takes to keep rebuilding the same 21 miles of coastline again and again for 100 years, hit that like button and subscribe.